When we discuss medieval English kings, I find that we talk about what events occurred during their kingship or what they accomplished during their lifetime, good or bad. But once they've died, their story has ended. And something that I feel is rarely talked about is what happened to their earthly remains and tombs, from the time of their deaths to our modern period. The Middle Ages is fascinating, specifically medieval kingship. In this video, we will look over each medieval king of England's burial site and what happened to them, starting with the only king in England to be granted the title of Great, Alfred the Great. While not a king of England, he did get the ball rolling on creating the Kingdom of England, and it's always good to start strong. We will end on the worst king of England, Henry VIII, as we can't really agree on when the Middle Ages ended. However, if you want to know why we end at Henry VIII, watch this video first. Let's begin. Alfred the Great died 899 AD. He belonged to the House of Wessex, and Winchester was the main city of King Alfred's reign. King Alfred is the only English king to have the title of Great, which was bestowed to him in the 16th century. Orderic Vitalis, a 12th century English chronicler, states that King Alfred was the first king to hold sway over the whole of England. Alfred's earthly remains were not left in peace over the centuries since his death. Alfred was originally interred at the Old Minster in Winchester, but he was moved to the New Minster by his son and successor, Edward the Elder, remaining there for some time before being moved again by the monks of Winchester to Hyde Abbey. This is where tracking King Alfred goes a bit pear-shaped. Because of the worst king of England, Henry VIII, and his dissolution of the monasteries, Hyde Abbey was suppressed, and all that remains is the gatehouse. Alfred's tomb was lost until the 18th century, when it was found during construction work for a prison. The remains were either crushed up or reburied. By the late 1990s, excavation work began on a burial site at St. Bartholomew's Church, yet the bones that were unearthed were not Alfred's. A pelvis bone was found during the excavation of Hyde Abbey, which has been subsequently tested and dated around the time period of Alfred's death, but the bone could also be of another Anglo-Saxon king of England. The main problem is finding a DNA match for the bone. Sadly, it's most likely that Alfred the Great's remains are lost to time. Edward the Elder, son of King Alfred. Edward died in 924, and like his fathers, his remains are now lost, being buried first at the New Minster in Winchester, and then moved to Hyde Abbey before suffering the same fate as his fathers, lost to time. Now we move on to the first king of the English, who established the Kingdom of England, King Athelstan, who is an interesting case, because he's the only English king to be buried at Malmesbury Abbey. Athelstan was not only a victorious king on the battlefield, but also a pious king who founded many churches and abbeys, while also promoting various saints. Athelstan struggled initially to gain the throne of Wessex due to his brother, but he died and the Witan did consider another candidate for the throne of Wessex. But eventually Athelstan gained the Wessex throne. But due to various reasons, Athelstan would not be buried in Winchester next to his father and grandfather. Rather, Athelstan was entombed at Malmesbury Abbey. As for Athelstan's remains, there isn't much information. William of Malmesbury, a 12th century historian, mentions that his bones were still visible, but after that I couldn't find any more information on Ethelstan's bones other than his tomb disappears. By the 15th century, there is an empty sarcophagus to commemorate him. King Edmund I, brother of Ethelstan, died 946 AD, buried at Glastonbury Abbey, remaining there until the dissolution of the monasteries. His bones are now lost, and spoilers, the dissolution of the monasteries as the reason for the loss of the remains is going to come up quite a bit. King Edward, brother of Edmund, died 955. His wishes, according to his will, implies he may have wanted to be entombed at Glastonbury Abbey. Instead, he was buried in Winchester. His remains may be in a mortuary chest at Winchester Cathedral, but again, the main issue is DNA testing. However, there is work in motion to test and reconstruct several of the skeletons to finally figure out who is who, or at least try to. King Edwig, son of Edmund I, died 959. A debaucherous king who clashed with his Archbishop of Canterbury. His reign was so poor that the Kingdom of England was split in two and shared with his younger brother, Edgar. Edwig is entombed at Winchester. King Edgar, son of Edmund I, died 975. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles state that in 959, here King Edwig passed away, and Edgar, his brother, succeeded to the kingdom both in Wessex and Mercia and in Northumbria, and he was 16 years old. Known as peaceful during his reign, he was entombed at Glastonbury Abbey until its suppression. Again, remains are now lost. Edward the Martyr died 978, son of King Edgar. His short reign is characterized by his death. He was murdered and quickly buried at Wareham Abbey, where miracles were attributed to him. Edward was later moved to Shaftesbury Abbey a year after his death. I'll give you 3 guesses as to what happened to Shaftesbury Abbey. It got shafted and torn down during the suppression. Yet there is some controversy with Edward's bones. Apparently, they're now on display at an Orthodox church, but there's little evidence to support this. The bones are most likely lost to time. Ethelred the Unready died 1016, son of King Edgar, known as the ill-advised king due to paying off the Vikings during their raiding of England instead of attacking them as his predecessors had done. Ethelred lost his throne once to Sven Forkbeard in 1013, but Sven died not long after, and Ethelred ruled until his death in 1016. He was entombed at Old St. Paul's Cathedral until 1666, when the Great Fire of London destroyed his and many other tombs. Sven Forkbeard, king by right of conquest, the first Norse king of England, who died in 1014 before any kind of coronation could occur. As for Sven's remains, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles only mentions the happy event of Sven's death occurred. The eulogy of Queen Emma, an 11th century manuscript, mentions that Sven's body was prepared by an English matron who had a ship ready to take Sven's embalmed body to Denmark. It mentions that Sven was buried initially in her country, perhaps York, before being laid to rest at Roskilde Cathedral, Denmark. Edmund Ironsides, son of Ethelred the Unready, died 30th of November 1016. All the councillors of the English race chose Edmund for king, and he resolutely defended his kingdom in his time. Edmund fought Sven's son and successor, Cnut, fighting him in various battles. Afterwards, an agreement was made to divide the Kingdom of England between the two men. Edmund died shortly after, and Cnut took over the rest of England in 1016. Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey near his grandfather, King Edgar. His bones are now lost due to the suppression of the abbeys. Cnut, son of Sven Forkbeard and king by the right of conquest, died 1035. Cnut established the North Sea Empire. Despite such an impressive empire, there are few sources for Cnut's reign. Cnut may have suffered from an illness that eventually killed him later on in life, dying at Shaftesbury Abbey near the shrine of Edward the Martyr. One of our sources mentions Cnut's heart being buried in Shaftesbury, and the rest of his remains were entombed at the Minster in Winchester. Perhaps Cnut chose to be buried with kings of the old regime to attest his legitimacy. His bones were moved after the Norman conquest into the new Winchester Cathedral and placed in a mortuary chest. By the 17th century, the bones of Cnut and others were scattered by the Roundheads, before being recovered and placed with other bones. But as mentioned before, the bones in the chests are still being DNA tested. Harold Harefoot, son of Cnut, died 1040 at Oxford. He nicked the throne of England from his brother Half-Cnut and was entombed at Old Abbey Church of St. Peter's, Westminster, London, before being dug up, mutilated, and then thrown into a marsh on the orders of his brother Half-Cnut. Harold's remains may have been retrieved and reburied at St. Clement's Danes Church, London. Harthacnut, son of Cnut, died 1042, and the last Danish king of England, a complete wanker, because he burnt my hometown of Worcester. Entombed at the Minster in Winchester, bones were placed in a mortuary chest when moved to Winchester Cathedral. Edward the Confessor, the last king of the House of Wessex, and later canonized as a saint, son of King Ethelred, died the 5th of January, 1066. King Edward ordered the construction of Westminster Abbey, but by the time of the abbey's consecration on December the 28th, 1065, Edward was already deathly ill, as he was consumed by the fire of his illness. Edward was entombed on the 6th of January, 1066. Edward the Confessor is the first king we've covered that is still resting at his original burial site, Westminster Abbey. While his remains have been moved around the abbey, once in 1163 and again in 1269 during Henry III's renovations, King Edward's remains even survived the suppression of the monasteries, unlike some of his predecessors and successors. Edward's coffin was moved during Henry VIII's reign, before being moved back during Mary I's reign. In 1685, Edward's coffin was damaged by a rafter that had fallen onto the tomb. Since then, Edward's coffin has remained in place within his shrine. Harold Godwinson, or Harold II, died 14th of October, 1066. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England, elected by the Witan and possibly named successor by his brother-in-law, Edward the Confessor, on his deathbed. Harold, while only king for a short time, left his mark on history with his victory at Stamford Bridge, but then only to lose his life at the Battle of Hastings, arguably one of the most famous battles in world history. As for his remains, it's a bit of a mystery. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles don't mention anything about where Harold's remains are, only that there was a great slaughter on either side. The Bayeux Tapestry, a Norman source, depicts Harold being chopped up or being hit in the eye by an arrow. Whatever was left of Harold, in some sources, was entombed at Waltham Abbey, or was buried by the seaside at Hastings, or buried where Battle Abbey is and then moved to Waltham Abbey, or buried at his birthplace at Bosham at the Holy Trinity Church. And the final theory is that by some miracle, Harold survived the Battle of Hastings. That tale comes from a manuscript titled The Life of Harold. One of our sources states, the manuscript appears to be an early 14th century copy of an original work from the late 12th century. The bottom line is that Harold survived and lived till the ripe old age as a hermit at Chester. The tale of where Harold Godwinson's remains could be is an open book. Without excavation and DNA testing, it's a mystery. William the Bastard, or William the Conqueror, the first Norman king and king by conquest, died 1087. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles state about William's death and burial, the sharp death which spares neither powerful men nor lowly. It seized him. He died in Normandy on the day immediately after the Nativity of St. Mary, and was buried in Caen at St. Stephen's Minster. Sounds simple enough, unless you were one of the mourners at the funeral. Instead of crying tears of grief, you'd be shouting, "Good grief, what a smell," as William's obese, swollen corpse had burst whilst being placed into his tomb. The service was promptly rushed, and afterwards nobody touched the egg and cress sandwiches. William's remains have been disturbed a few times, with the majority of his remains lost in 1562 during the War of Religion in France, leaving only his thigh bone left. What was left of William was again disturbed during the French Revolution in 1793. There is only a slab dedicated to William now. William Rufus, or William II, king by succession, third son of William the Conqueror, died 1100 in the New Forest, Hampshire. A rather forgettable king whose death by an arrow shot in the New Forest is arguably more famous than his rule. After his death, William's body was left while the nobles that were with him rushed back to secure their own lands. William's body was eventually moved and placed onto a cart. He was then quickly buried in Winchester, near or under one of the towers, which collapsed not long afterwards. The collapse of the tower is used by contemporary chroniclers as a sign of displeasure by God. As with other remains in Winchester Cathedral, William's remains may have been scattered and then placed into one of the boxes or placed into another coffin. Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, king by quick succession, died December 1135. A powerful king who conquered Normandy by beating and imprisoning his elder brother, Robert Curthose. Robert died in 1134 and has a magnificent tomb at Gloucester Cathedral. As for King Henry's tomb, well, it's kind of lost, but maybe one day it might be found. King Henry was entombed at Reading Abbey, which he founded, and is the only king buried there. I've said it enough times, but you can guess what happened to Reading Abbey. However, there has been a substantial amount of work made into finding Henry's tomb or bones, but nothing yet. King Stephen, nephew of King Henry, died 1154. King by proclamation, or a usurper depending on your interpretation. King Henry's male heirs had died in the White Ship disaster, and only his daughter, the Empress Matilda, was the last heir of King Henry's direct line. Yet Stephen took the throne. What followed was a civil war known as the Anarchy. Peace was restored when King Stephen came to an agreement with Empress Matilda's son, Henry, to adopt him as heir. King Stephen died not long afterwards and was entombed with his wife, Queen Matilda, at Faversham Abbey. There is nothing left of Faversham Abbey, no visible ruins whatsoever, and King Stephen's remains are lost to time. In one of the last pages of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, it states about King Stephen's death. 1154. In this year, King Stephen died, and was buried where his wife and son were buried, at Faversham, the minster that they had made. King Henry II, grandson of Henry I, king by succession, died 1189. One of, if not the most powerful medieval kings of England. King Henry inherited large swathes of land. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine granted even more land to him, which in turn created an empire known as the Angevin Empire. Roger of Howden gives an account of King Henry's burial. His son and successor, Richard, had travelled to Fontevraud Abbey, where Henry's body was being prepared for burial. Henry's body had been stripped of valuables shortly after he died, and when Richard, weeping heavily, approached the body, blood flowed out of Henry's nostrils. After Henry's entombment, his remains were left undisturbed until the French Revolution, where they were most likely scattered and lost. Richard the Lionheart, or Richard I, son of King Henry II, king by succession, died 1199. Buried at Fontevraud Abbey, and like his father's, remains lost to time. Only his heart remains at Rouen, but it's rotted into a brown powder. Although the heart has been analysed, the scientific journal is in the top comment tab if you'd like to read it. King John, or John Lackland, died 1216, son of King Henry II and king by succession. I'm not spending too much time talking about John, as I made a 3-hour video about him. His remains are entombed at Worcester Cathedral and remain as such. The country was in a civil war, so Worcester was the only suitable place for him at the time of his death. The only thing I'll say is that his tomb's effigy was scrubbed of colour by the bloody Victorians. King Henry III, or Henry of Winchester, died 1272, son of King John and king by a close succession. One of the longest reigning kings of England, and known for remodelling Westminster Abbey in devotion to his patron saint, Edward the Confessor. Many contemporary chroniclers write differing accounts of his life and death. My favourite is Thomas Wicks's account. Henry III's body was fittingly decked out with the richest clothes and the royal crown. All believe that, when it was being carried by specially chosen nobles of the realm on a bier for burial, it shone with greater splendour than it had in life. Henry's remains are still in place at Westminster Abbey, only being moved a few times. His heart was moved to Fontevraud Abbey. Edward I, or Edward Longshanks, died 1307, son of Henry III, king by succession. Entombed not far from his father's tomb at Westminster Abbey, considered another great medieval king, Edwardus Magnus, and the last crusading king, participating in the 9th Crusade. His tomb, compared to his father's, is more simplistic and lacks an effigy. What is interesting is the journey Edward's remains took shortly after death. To preface this, Edward is an old Anglo-Saxon name. After all, Edward's father, Henry, had a great fondness towards Edward the Confessor. So, after the Norman conquest, King Edward was the first king to be named with an Anglo-Saxon name. Now back to King Edward's journey to burial. The location the body first rested at was none other than Waltham Abbey, one of the alleged locations of Harold Godwinson's resting place, the first Anglo-Saxon named king since the conquest, was first rested at the alleged burial site of the last Anglo-Saxon king. Quite a coincidence. Edward II, or Edward of Carnarvon, died 1327, son of Edward I, king by succession. Edward is the first and only king to be entombed at Gloucester Cathedral. Edward II was pretty bad at being king, so much so he was made to abdicate for his young son. The leaders of this group that forced Edward II out was led by his wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward II died under mysterious circumstances in 1327. Most likely, he was murdered, and there's a few theories on how he died. But that's for another video, and I won't poke at that subject today. As for the reason for Edward's entombment at Gloucester Cathedral, one reason could be it was easier having a quick burial, so the new regime could focus on stability and legitimacy. And Gloucester Cathedral wasn't far from where Edward died. Gloucester is an old city, and not far from the cathedral is St. Oswald's Priory, which did contain the tomb of Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians. Again, another Anglo-Saxon connection coincidence. Edward's remains are still at Gloucester, and his tomb is still in fine condition. Edward III, or Edward of Windsor, died 1377, son of Edward II, king from forced abdication of his predecessor. A far better king than his father, Edward started the 116 Years' War with France over the French throne. Some of the money made from the war went to remodelling Windsor Castle. Yet Edward is entombed at Westminster Abbey, and after researching over 20 different kings, Westminster Abbey is the safest place for their remains. His body was buried at Westminster with all reverence. Richard II died 1400, grandson of Edward III and son of Edward the Black Prince, king by succession and king at the age of 10. Despite showing promise during the Peasants' Revolt, Richard was a disappointing medieval king of England, and he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke and imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, where he died at the age of 33. Most likely, he was starved to death. His body was displayed to the public to show he had died and no foul play was involved. Richard was first entombed at King's Langley Priory before being moved to Westminster Abbey in 1413 into the tomb he had ordered to be constructed for himself a few years after his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died in 1394, where they both remain. Henry IV, or Henry Bolingbroke, died 1413, grandson of Edward III and son of John of Gaunt, king by usurpation, entombed at Canterbury Cathedral and the only English king buried there. Henry was a big fan of Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, and wished to be entombed near his favourite saint, much like Henry III and Edward the Confessor. Saints were like the action heroes of the Middle Ages. People had their favourite ones. Henry is still there to this day. Henry V, or Henry of Monmouth, died 1422, son of Henry IV, king by succession. Henry V was the medieval embodiment of kick ass and chew gum, a warrior king who battered the French, yet died at the young age of 35. If Henry had lived a bit longer, he would have been both King of England and France. Henry died in France, and his body was taken back to England and entombed at Westminster Abbey. Henry VI died 1471, son of Henry V, king by succession. Henry VI was King of England and France for a time. Yet despite these prestigious titles, Henry VI was a poor king, plagued by mental health issues. His energetic wife, Margaret of Anjou, tried to keep his reign going, but eventually Henry was deposed and killed at the Tower of London. Buried at an obscure location, Chertsey Abbey, Henry's remains were later moved to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle by Richard III. Henry VII tried to have Henry VI venerated and even built a shrine for him at Westminster Abbey, but the plans never came to fruition, and Henry VI is still entombed at Windsor Castle. Edward IV died 1483, king by conquest. Edward was the son of Richard, Duke of York, and had a claim to the English throne thanks to being a descendant of Edward III, taking the throne from the enfeebled Henry VI. Edward was another warrior king who, while in his youth, cut a powerful figure, but as he aged, his diet and illnesses weakened him, leading to his death at the age of just 40. His body was laid in state at St. Stephen's Chapel until 16th of April, before interment at Windsor. Yet his tomb was destroyed by the parliamentarians during the English Civil War, and a simple black marble slab now marks his grave. Edward V died some time after April 1483, king but uncrowned, son of Edward IV. Perhaps the most controversial burial and death, Edward V and his brother Richard are known as the famous Princes in the Tower, as they disappeared while they were confined at the Tower of London. We cannot say for certain where the boys are entombed, and to explain their deaths and burial is an enormous task which needs its own video. Richard III died 1485, uncle of Edward V and brother of Edward IV, king by proclamation or a usurper depending on your interpretation. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York. Richard III's story of his burial is incredibly famous in the UK, with Richard's skeleton being excavated under a car park at Leicester in 2012, and the rediscovery of his remains led to a boom in trying to find other kings, which still carries on today, as after his bloody death at Bosworth, he was simply entombed at Greyfriars Abbey after his corpse had suffered mocking and stripped bare. Richard's remains were lost during the dissolution of the abbeys, and as mentioned, found again. Richard's remains now lie in a lovely modern tomb at Leicester Cathedral. Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, died 1509, king by conquest, or a usurper depending on your interpretation, the head of a new dynasty, the Tudors. Henry's reign was a stressful one, winning the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field and marrying Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth, which secured the throne, as Henry himself had such a weak claim to it. But despite this, Henry still faced uprisings, and his dynasty was secured thanks to his son, Prince Arthur. Yet sadly, Arthur died, and Elizabeth died shortly after childbirth. Combined with the stressful nature of kingship, Henry died in 1509 and was entombed at Westminster Abbey. Henry VIII, or Henry, the Heritage Destroyer. Now we come to the king who is mainly responsible for the loss of many of his predecessors' burial sites. Despite starting off as a darling prince of Europe, Henry's later reign is filled with cruelty, fear, and destruction. When his reign came to an end in 1547, he was entombed at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where he has remained since. I hope you all enjoyed exploring the burial sites of the medieval kings of England. If you would like to support the channel, you can on Patreon or YouTube channel membership. Cheers.